Hey there. I want to ask what your association is with the word scattered. So take just a second and think about that. What do you associate with the word scattered? For me, I don't have a necessarily great association. It kind of goes back to a story of something that happened when I was in college. You just go places and do things with people just because, doesn't really have to be any reason. Taco Bell run at 2 a.m. in the morning? Sure. We're not worried about heartburn. Someone wants to go to Sam's? You don't need anything from there? Sure. Why not? Going to Sam's. So one day I go to Sam's Club with a few of my friends. There's some guys there, some girls there. And I remember one of the girls is looking, I think she was looking for some candy for her social club. And so we go back to the candy section and there's this massive bag of hot tamales. Now, I don't mean hot tamales as in the actual food. I'm talking about the candy. And if you're not familiar with hot tamales, they're red, kind of oval shaped, jelly bean type consistency, and they've got a cinnamon flavor. Okay, so this massive bag that you can only get from Sam's, this huge bag of hot tamales, and so we get that. Whoever else needs gets whatever else they need, and we're all walking toward the front of the store, and then I'm just shocked by the sound of a 410 shotgun going off in the middle of Sam's Club. Well, what sounded like that, because it was actually the sound of that massive bag had been dropped, and we won't name names to protect the guilty. That bag had been dropped and hit the concrete floor of Sam's, and this incredibly loud noise. Along with the loud noise, two other things happened. First of all, everybody in that entire Sam's Club, whether they were customers or employees, they all turn and look at us, okay? The center of attention. This is that record stops and you're singing along too loud in an off-key voice type of moment. Everybody's looking at us. And secondly, those little hot tamale candies just scattered basically to the four corners of the earth, okay? They went in a million different directions. I think this happened over 25 years ago, and I'm convinced if you went in that Sam's Club today, there would still be hot tamales, petrified by now, but they'd be hiding somewhere in that Sam's Club. So, scattered. When I think of that word, it's not really a great association there for me. And I think a lot of us don't like the word scattered. It means that we've lost a closeness. Some of us talk about being scatterbrained. That's not a good association. For the early church, scattered would not have been a great association either. When you come along in the book of Acts, they have some issues here and there, but up until and there's even some persecution that comes in pretty early on. But nothing really all that bad happens until chapter 7. The latter part of chapter 6, you see that some people basically are wanting to go after Stephen. And then in chapter 7, he gives this amazing speech to the crowd, and they don't like it. They don't like the voice of God. They don't want to hear it. And even though the Bible tells us that he basically he looked like an angel, I mean the holiness, the glow of God was upon him. He just they hated him. They rushed toward him, put their hands over their ear, literally. They didn't want to hear anymore, and they started throwing stones, and they stoned him to death. Now we would hope at the end of that, after chapter 7, that after this great tragedy and how awful it was, what happened to them, that there would be a great outpouring of understanding and sympathy for the Christian community. But in fact, the exact opposite is what happened. There was no sympathy for the early Christians. In fact, this martyrdom of Stephen emboldened a young Saul and many others who hated the church, they said, hey, we're in now. We're all in. We've done murdered this guy, and we're going to go all in to get rid of Christianity. And so the Bible tells us that there's this massive persecution that breaks out in Jerusalem. Again, Saul is going from house to house, arresting both men and women and believers. Another place later on in the chapter talks about him breathing out murderous threats. I mean, he really hated them along with others that hated these early Christians. And so these people, the Christians, the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 8, they actually start to scatter. They start to spread out from Jerusalem, and they start scattering across Judea and Samaria. Now, that is very interesting that the Bible tells us that, because the early church was doing great. I mean, they were teaching, preaching, loving, caring, worshiping, fellowshipping, praying, doing everything they're supposed to do, right? Lots of good stuff. But Jesus had told them, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and to the uttermost parts of the world. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, he included all these in here. Well, it was just kind of staying in Jerusalem. It wasn't getting out there the way it really needed to get out there. And so at this point, it's interesting. The Bible never does not tell us that God was allowing this persecution or caused this persecution to spank the Christians and tell them to do what they were supposed to do. It never says that. But it is interesting to note that things had just not really gone much past Jerusalem to this point. But when the persecution breaks out, then these people start to scatter. Okay? And they leave Jerusalem, where they'd been all gathered together in a holy huddle and, singing Kumbaya. And I joke. They were doing lots of good things, okay? Worshiping, loving, serving, ministering, reaching out, evangelizing. They were doing all these awesome things, but they were keeping them there in Jerusalem. And so with this persecution that comes along, the Bible tells us that the apostles stayed tight there in Jerusalem, but most everybody else, man, they were getting out of town. And so they were leaving the borders of Jerusalem, and they were heading out into the larger area of Judea and even into Samaria. And so they were going in these places. And then listen to what Acts chapter 8 verse 4 tells us. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Those who'd been scattered preached the word wherever they went. And that's basically the preface for the story that we get about Simon and how he goes down, Philip, how he goes down to Samaria. And then later we get a story about Philip and the Ethiopian. These stories come out of the general context, though, where the Acts is telling us, hey, it's not just them. This is part of a much larger movement where these folks, in their discomfort, in their distress, in this really tough and difficult time, as they are having to readjust their lives and redo their lives in new and different ways, one thing that hasn't changed is their love for the Lord. And in fact, that as they move and go different places, that love for the Lord and that desire to serve Him is showing out and being discovered and seen by new people. And so, today I just want to encourage you with the fact that, hey, even though we're limited in a lot of ways, if we've adjusted a lot of things that we're doing, we also have a lot of new opportunities. One of the things someone told me right after we first kind of went into the shelter in place over the coronavirus is, hey, now when I get on Facebook, every time I turn around, there is a Bible study, there's a sermon, there's something going on where we're hearing about God. And so in these difficult circumstances, God knew about it ahead of time. And Scattered, yeah, it's a scary and ugly word, and we're kind of scattered as a church right now. We don't get to gather, at least physically, like we're used to. We're trying to gather online. And we have online worship services. Some churches have drive-up services. Some are trying to do Zoom Bible studies, and there's all kind of different things. And by the way, there's no knock on one being better than the other. We're all doing our best to follow the Lord's command in this time in which life as we know it, life as normal, has been upset. We've been scattered, but God's word has not been stopped and it has not been hindered. And so I just want to encourage you that wherever you go and however your ways of contacting people has changed, remember that your light can and should still shine very brightly for the Lord.